Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Karen Grimson. I'm a curatorial assistant in the Department of Drawings and Prints here at MoMa, where I had the pleasure of working on this exhibition, Tarsila do Amaral, Inventing Modern Art in Brazil, under the guidance and mentorship of curator Luis Pérez-Oramas. The show is the first in the United States devoted to the Brazilian modernist, and it was co-organized with the Art Institute of Chicago, where it was on view last year and curated by Stephanie D'Alessandro. Tonight, we're delighted to welcome you to the first public program organized in conjunction with the show, where we'll have the pleasure of hearing the voice of legendary figure Caetano Veloso in conversation with Luis. Before I pass it on to Caetano and Luis, I just wanted to briefly extend our profound gratitude to our friends at the General Consulate of Brazil in New York. And we're equally indebted to the group of people working at UNS Produções, Paula, Felipe, João. Thank you for all your efforts in bringing and accompanying Caetano to New York. The exhibition has been made possible by a number of foundations and individuals, one of whom I see here in the audience tonight. Clarice, thank you for your wonderful support. And now, without further ado, I welcome Luis and Caetano Veloso.
Well, thank you to you all. Thank you, Caetano. I have some notes and questions for you tonight. But first, I am Luis Pérez-Oramas, and I organized this exhibition with my colleague Stephanie D'Alessandro, who I don't see tonight here, but she might be around here. It opened last October at the Art Institute of Chicago, and then it opened at MoMA last February. And, well, I want to particularly thank Karen Grimson, who just introduced us today, because she made this possible. When I was asked from the Education Department, what could we do? And I say, why don't we invite Caetano Veloso? I never thought that you would say yes. I never thought that this would happen. And suddenly, I left MoMA last May, and Karen materialized it. So thank you, Karen, and thank you, the Department of Education, Wendy, everybody, and obviously MoMA. Paula, Lavigne, Felipe, João, he's not here, but thank you very much. I was telling Caetano that I will do we'll just make some brief introduction. Especially, I think everybody here understands why we want to hear Caetano Veloso talking about Tarsila and Oswald and anthropophagia and obviously tropicalismo and Tropicália. But maybe for the Americans who are not that aware of that history, addressing Tarsila means addressing anthropophagia, and addressing anthropophagia means obviously addressing the way its message, its legacy was received or not, was delayed or not, was embraced in a sort of belatedness. We all know that Anthropophagia and the Manifesto Antropofagico, which is right there, the original one, was written by Oswald de Andrade. Oswald was intertwined with Tarsila. There was Tarsivald. They were ensemble. They were together in the 1920s. And somehow Tarsila anticipated visually what Oswald would write in the manifesto. And even if Tarsila was kind of a permanent presence in the cultural landscape of Brazil since the 1920s, it happened that Oswald and anthropophagia were kind of left in a sort of forgetfulness, and they were a little bit of somehow forgotten. For decades, Oswald continued to write magnificent essays and poems, and then this is a short story that is certainly much more complex than what I'm telling to you. But in the late 1960s and in the early 1970s, but notably in the late 1960s, it happened that Caetano and Gil and Gal and Betania and the Tropicalistas re-embraced the message of anthropophagia and somehow gave them a new life, or contributed to give them a new life. And I've been always fascinated by belatedness, by these kind of delays and two different lives and afterlives in our history is one of my favorite subjects. And I think that when I proposed this show at MoMA, and when Stephanie invited me to work with her on this exhibition, I knew that I wanted to address that topic. I knew that I wanted to address that kind of anachronism or belatedness, and the way anthropophagia became truly a living message for a whole generation of Brazilians in the late 60s, and then finally achieved its message and its legacy vis-a-vis the social body in Brazil. Something that probably did not happen in the 1920s. It is a subject of discussion because probably Brazil was not ready in the 1920s for that, maybe. It's a question mark. And all this obviously has to do with the relevance of Tarsila today. I am not saying that the work of Tarsila was not relevant by itself. It was. But I am sure and I am convinced that part of the actuality of Tarsila today, why she continues to be such a young artist, has to do with this re-embracement of anthropophagia, this re-embracement of early modernity by Caetano and by his generation in the 1960s. We know that Elliot Tisik and Lydia Clark were also exchanging letters and mentioning Oswald and Tarsila. We know that other artists at that time, Antonio Diaz, Antonio Manuel Maiolino, were also thinking of that. But I think you played an immense role in that process, and that's one of the reasons I wanted really to have this conversation. I think this is an incredible privilege for this institution and for us to have you here. I am immensely grateful for having accepted this unlikely invitation. And so the thing is that Caetano has written some of the most insightful and beautiful recollections of that process, just briefly described in this magnificent book that is titled Verdades Tropical. It is a magnificent book. And I remember in a bus in Niterói when I was living in Paris, in Sao Paulo, reading this book, going to visit an artist back in deep Niterói, and I was totally fascinated by this writing. And I'm always late. I've admired your work since my childhood, but then I realized that I was also admiring a great writer, and you are a great writer. And obviously it's late because your letters are letters of a great poet. So, and so it happened, and this is just a bit of a personal story, is that I had the opportunity of curating two shows here at MoMA on Brazilian women artists. One on Lydia Clark, and this one on Tarsila. And it happened that I have found inspiration for those two projects in your book, and in the two essays I have quoted you. And so it was, to me, obvious when they asked me, even if I knew that I was kind of risking the impossible answer, to say, let's invite Caetano to MoMA to have a conversation with him on Tarsila. And so, Caetano, again, thank you. And let's begin with, I have a question, and the question is just, why don't you tell us again, for us who have read this, and advise you, look for this book. This is a magnificent book. This is the autobiography of Tropicalismo, and it's magnificently written. It's really one of the best books I've read. And you write in that book, you kind of give the story of that day when you went to see the restaging of O Rei da Vela, a piece of theater written by Oswald de Andrade, staged by Ceselso, Teatro d'Oficina, and with scenography conceived by Elio H. Bauer, who you say is one of the most important figures of Tropicalismo, and someone with whom you have worked. Some of your covers for your records, your settings for your concerts have been conceived with him. And then that day, it was like an epiphany or like a revelation. You were really taken by that. I mean, later on you would say, sharing that maybe that was not the best Oswald, that you had even more to discover his poetry and his writings. But that would be wonderful if you tell us again that story.
Well, in 1967, I had already recorded my first so-called tropicalist album. And then somebody told me that this play by Oswald de Andrade was being staged by Teatro Oficina, directed by Zé Celso. And I had seen something by Zé Celso in the Oficina group stagings. And I was curious, and I had heard of Oswald twice. In fact, when I was in high school, a friend of mine told me, more interesting than Mário de Andrade is Oswald de Andrade. We were teenagers, and I heard that name, and then but he was a colleague whom I respected a lot, but he was a very collected character, like he was, well educated and refined, came from a family of people who worked with law, judges and lawyers. And I heard that, and that just stayed there in the back of my head, that name, Oswald de Andrade. He said he was a lot more interesting than Mário, because Mário was referred to in schools, in newspapers, articles, in conversations. He was present because he had made folkloric researches, all over Brazil, and his literature was kind of respected without being really known. His work as a writer was not really often referred to. But he was kind of a name that everybody respected. But Oswald was not. Oswald had been forgotten, and he was not respected. And years later, in fact in 1967, before I left Rio for São Paulo, I heard two friends of ours, two writers in fact, and one of them had published a book, released a book that called Pan America, and it was quite radical, style-wise and everything, and theme-wise. It was an incredible book. It was something totally new, and I was amazed. His name is José Agripino de Paula. And my friend from Bahia, Rogério Duarte, who was a very intelligent guy, with whom I had been having talks about the relevance of so considered low-quality pop music, Brazilian traditional, sentimental kitsch, he had he had ways of, reviving these things in his conversations. So I was seeing the two of them, the author of the book and this friend of mine, talking about the first guy's book. And then my friend from Bahia, he was very anarchical but very eloquent. And he said, you are really from São Paulo, because your book, when you read it, you have Mário de Andrade and all the Modern Art Week of 1922, Then Agrippino said, no, Mário de Andrade, no. It's not, no, I'm not interested. Then my friend said, well, your writing is amazing, but it has nothing to do, for example, with Guimarães Rosa. He said, no. No. Then he stopped a little and he said, maybe, Oswald de Andrade had something. It was the only thing from the 1922 famous week, Modern Art Week, that he accepted. That was like, it echoed the comment my colleague at high school had made, and I was curious. So when I heard that a play by this person was being staged by José Celso, whose stagings that I had seen before impressed me well, but they were pretty European, very refined, staging of good plays, but it was sophisticated. Then I went to see what is going to. Then when I saw it, it was like, this is everything I want to do in my record, which is already done. It was ready already. My first album. Then I wanted to talk to Zé Celso, because so I went to him and I was, enthusiastically talking about the play. It was incredible. And later I'll talk more about Hélio Eichbauer, because the set design, the stage set design was incredible. And the play was, a slap in your face. It was a new thing and very aggressive, aesthetically and politically. It was a really new thing to me. Then I went to Augusto de Campos, because I had already met him and his brother Haroldo de Campos and Décio Pignatari, the leaders of the concrete poetry movement in São Paulo. And then I told Augusto, this play by Oswald de Andrade that's been staged by Zé Celso is amazing. Then he said to me, I'm going to see it. I'm interested, because we are very interested in Oswald. In fact, we have written about him, and in fact, his theater is not the best of him. And then he started giving me books by Oswald, poetry, and 2 novels, his modernist novels, which were wonderful. Then I started, and the manifestos. Then I was reading those things, and I was thinking, this guy, most of the anthropophagus manifesto, and it was like he's explaining what we are feeling and what we are trying to do now. It's unbelievable. I was, in fact, I thought, how could I make this record without having read that before? It was incredible. So later I learned that the painter, whose name I knew and whose images I had seen much more than I had heard of Oswald in my entire life, was behind it all. In fact, that bowl here, the bull, the
little bull there.
the
Yeah.
ox. It's also called the ox in the forest. Ox in the forest. And
And that's a painting at the Bahia
yeah,
Modern Museum.
it was in Bahia. So I knew it. And I knew Tarsila's name and everything. But then I learned, reading the manifesto, Oswald's manifesto, that she was behind it because a painting of hers that is part of the inspiration of this one here, and it's
The Abaporu
right
here.
there. Abaporu inspired Oswald to write this. I'm pronouncing Oswald because that's the way he pronounced, the way his friends pronounced, his family pronounced. The name was taken from a French thing. Most people in Brazil now say Oswald or Oswald, which is, they would hate it because they pronounced Oswald, and he sometimes signed Osvaldo. And Mario, who was very Brazilian.
Caetano,
He always said Oswald.
Oswald. You write this beautiful thing in your book. Oswald de Andrade, being a great constructivist writer, was also a prophet for the new left and for pop art. He could not have been overlooked by the young artists working during the 1960s. These undigested anthropophagus, I love that. This undigested anthropophagus.
So do I.
Well, you wrote it. This undigested
like it
anthropophagus.
I'm a Leo,
who was rejected during long decades by the Brazilian culture and who conceived a Brazilian utopia capable of overcoming patriarchal messianism in favor of a primal and modern matriarchate, became for us the very great father. I love that paragraph. And
I love it too.
This primal and modern matriarchate. And just about the primal and modern matriarchate, because you are mentioning Tarsila, and one of the issues that, we as curators, obviously this is a show on Tarsila do Amaral, not on Oswald, but necessarily also on Oswald. And with my co-curator, we discussed at length that, well, somehow Tarsila was a visual thinking, and Oswald was the poetic thinking, and they were really, really complementary. They are correlated to each other, but I think that somehow she was kind of anticipating visually those things. The
Yes,
anticipatory icon, the figure before the name of that modern and primal matriarchate begins even with a negra in 1923, which is behind this wall, that incredible and monumental portrait of a black woman. No?
Yeah, and a negra is a foretelling of Abaporu.
Of Abaporu, absolutely. And the things that happen between a negra, Abaporu, and then anthropophagia is kind of the visual narrative of this process before the manifesto would have been written by Oswald. So to quote Haroldo about another thing he says that Tarsila's landscapes are monumental abbreviations, which is beautiful, monumental abbreviations of a lost nature. This is a monumental abbreviation of what you are recalling us here, no? But I wanted to ask you about your process at that moment.
Very confused.
No. You will see. It's not because when you are in this beautiful book talking about the way you conceived alegría. She's almost an anthem of tropicalismo. No, you were saying that you were not looking for blending, but rather sampling.
Yeah,
and you mentioned. You were rejecting fusion, stressing sampling, avant la lettre, no? And you say this arrangement as ready-made. And, I quote you, instead of working towards finding a homogeneous sound that could define the new style, we were rather used another sonority that was recognizable in commercial music, making arrangements that were independent elements capable of clarifying the song, but also clashing with it. So I am saying this because this process, even for Tarsila, is not without friction. this kind of friction, this kind of sampling, these two figures that then suddenly are collaged and become this manifesto, no? And I see a parallelism with what you were trying at that moment. And I will continue interrupting you, but it would be great.
I think you might find lots of things that would connect whatever we did in the late 60s and whatever we dreamt doing with Tarsila's work. But it was not, as I told before, it was not an immediate contact with Tarsila's images that moved us. And even the stage set designed by Elio Eichbauer, which is genius, has more of Tarsila's time than of Tarsila as an individual artist. Tarsila was more, I'd say, feminine than that, and girlish, and what she was looking for as a primitive, not academic thing in her feelings for color and forms came from her childhood in the farm of her family, in her family's farm. And even that it has forms of Tarsila, but the colors are like, because, so many things, my head is very confused always. And when you were talking about matriarchate, I was thinking of women in Oswald's life, Before Tarsila, there was this young girl. I want to tell the story. It's, they had, it's too crazy, but anyway, they had this garçonnière. Maybe those who don't speak Portuguese don't know what garçonnière means, although it's a French word. Garçonnière, but an apartment for guys to have sexual encounters or just, conviviality with other guys to talk and then maybe bring in some girls and everything. So one 18-year-old girl, she was a student, was amazingly intelligent and beautiful, and they nicknamed her Miss Cyclone. The thing is, they bought this big copybook and they took notes every day. She would write in the copybook too, Miss Cyclone. They also called her Daisy, but her name was Maria. I forgot. Maria Vitória, a very Portuguese Brazilian name, normal, and but Oswald fell in love with her, and they started an affair. But once he saw her with a guy going to Brás, with another guy, and he was jealous. Then he saw her going in a boy's house, like a pension for boy students, male students. And he was more jealous. Then he was going to talk to her, ask her, where are you going? What other guys are you seeing? But then she said to him, I'm pregnant. And and you can read that because the copybook became kind of an incredible collage novel that tells this story by fragments. It's beautiful. It's an incredible thing. And she said, I'm pregnant. Then he thought, by whom? And she couldn't, she didn't know either. So they decided for the abortion. And in the abortion, she got very ill, and she was obviously going to die because of the abortion. Then Oswald married her. Oswald married her, and in 1 week's time she died. And he buried her in his family's tomb, along with his mother, or whatever, his grandmother. And
With the matriarchy.
And she died with his name in the end, de Andrade, Maria something de Andrade, you know. And it's an incredible story. This is one of the stories of women with Oswald. After Tarsila came Pagu, who was a trans cyclone, you know. Yes.
Wow.
I think he needed them that way. And Tarsila was the most tame of them all. But still, be aware of this tame case.
Cyclonic too.
It's cyclonic too. She was incredible.